Today is Monday, July 20th, 2026, and today is National Moon Day, which is one of those national days that gives you an excuse to look up at the sky tonight and remember that human beings somehow figured out how to leave this planet, land on the moon, and come back home again. That's still an incredible sentence to say out loud. But as I dug through today's history, I noticed something that quietly connected all of today's stories. None of them seemed world-changing at first. They look like ordinary moments. A single sale, a popular song, and someone taking a seat at the front of a meeting. But history has a funny way of hiding extraordinary change inside moments that didn't seem extraordinary until much later. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone increasingly convinced that history is mostly people improvising with confidence. Our first story begins with a sale that probably didn't seem very historic at the time. On July 20th, 1903, the Ford Motor Company shipped its very first automobile to a paying customer. That customer wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a wealthy industrialist. He wasn't even another engineer. He was a dentist from Chicago named Dr. Ernest Fenning. Today, Ford is one of the most recognizable names in the automotive world. Millions of vehicles roll off assembly lines every year, and it's difficult to imagine a time when owning a car was anything but ordinary. But in 1903, automobiles were still something of a curiosity. Most Americans still traveled by horse and buggy. Roads were largely unpaved. Gasoline stations didn't exist, and many people questioned whether these noisy new machines would ever become practical for everyday life. Henry Ford believed they would. Just over a month before his first sale, Ford Motor Company had been incorporated with only a handful of employees and a modest amount of investment. The company was far from guaranteed success. In fact, Ford himself had already experienced 2 failed automotive companies before finally getting this opportunity. The car shipped to Dr. Fenning was a Model A, not to be confused with the much more famous Model A introduced in the late 1920s. This early Model A produced about 8 horsepower, could reach speeds approaching 30 miles per hour under ideal conditions, and sold for $850, a considerable sum at the time. Yet Dr. Fenning believed enough in this strange new invention to become Ford's very first customer. That single purchase did more than put one automobile on the road. It gave a young company its first proof that people were willing to invest in a future powered by something other than horses. Within just a few years, Ford would introduce the Model T, revolutionize manufacturing with the moving assembly line, and help transform automobiles from luxury items into everyday transportation. I've always liked this story because history often remembers the inventor. It doesn't always remember the first person willing to take a chance on the invention. Without early believers like Dr. Fenning, some of history's biggest ideas might never have found enough momentum to change the world. Speaking of ordinary moments that unexpectedly shaped how millions of people saw the world, our next story begins with a song that helped define an entire image of California by proving that sometimes songs don't just climb the charts. They change the way people imagine an entire place. On July 20th, 1963, Jan and Dean's Surf City reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Today, it's hard to separate California from images of surfing, beaches, woody wagons, sunshine, and endless summer. But in the early 1960s, that picture was still taking shape. Surf City became one of the songs that helped paint it. The song was written by Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys and his friend Jan Berry of the duo Jan and Dean. At first, Wilson intended to record it with the Beach Boys, but he ultimately gave it to Jan and Dean instead. That decision didn't sit particularly well with Murray Wilson, Brian's father and manager, who believed Brian had handed a potential hit to another group. As it turned out, he was right. Surf City became Jan and Dean's biggest success and the first surf rock song ever to reach number 1 on the Billboard charts. Ironically, the city in the song didn't actually exist. It was a fictional place where there were 2 girls for every boy. Perfect waves, sunshine, and not much to worry about beyond having a good time. That imaginary city helped sell a very real image of Southern California. For teenagers across America and eventually around the world, California became more than a state. It became an idea, a place that represented freedom, youth, beaches, and endless summer. Of course, anyone who actually sat in Los Angeles traffic knows the real California is a little bit more complicated than that. I've always found it fascinating that one catchy song could help shape the identity of an entire region. We often think culture reflects the world around us. Sometimes it helps create the world people expect to find. Speaking of changing expectations, our final story isn't about music. It's about changing who people expect to see in positions of leadership. On July 20th, 1921, Representative Alice Mary Robertson of Oklahoma became the first woman to preside over a session of the United States House of Representatives. Today, seeing women serving in leadership roles throughout government feels entirely natural. In 1921, it was anything but. The 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote, had been ratified less than a year earlier. Women were only beginning to enter national politics in meaningful numbers, and many Americans still questioned whether they belonged there at all. Alice Robertson had already lived an extraordinary life before arriving in Congress. She worked as a teacher, operated a ranch, managed a post office, founded schools for Native American children, and served as a Red Cross volunteer during World War I. When she was elected to Congress in 1920, she became only the second woman ever elected to the House of Representatives. Just months later, she was invited to preside over the House while Speaker Frederick Gillett stepped away. It wasn't a permanent position. It lasted only a short time. But symbolism often matters just as much as duration. For the first time in American history, a woman stood at the Speaker's podium, called the House to order, recognized members to speak, and guided the legislative proceedings. It quietly demonstrated something that had never been seen before. A role that many assumed belonged exclusively to men didn't. Sometimes history changes with a dramatic speech. Sometimes it changes simply because someone walks into a room where no one expected them to be. But before we wrap up today's stories, today's birthday belongs to Natalie Wood, who was born on July 20th, 1938. Natalie Wood's career began almost before she was old enough to read the script she was performing. She appeared in films as a young child and quickly became one of Hollywood's brightest young stars. Unlike many child actors, she successfully made the difficult transition into adult roles, earning Academy Award nominations for films including Rebel Without a Cause, Splendor in the Grass, and Love with the Proper Stranger. She also starred in two of the most beloved movie musicals ever made, West Side Story and Gypsy. Audience connected with her because she brought both vulnerability and strength to her characters, making them feel remarkably human. Although her life ended tragically at just 43 years old, her performances continued to introduce new generations to classic Hollywood cinema. I've always admired Natalie Wood because she refused to be defined by the expectations that often limit child performers. She kept growing, taking on more challenging roles and proving she was far more than the child star people first knew. The more I thought about today's stories, the more I realized they all began with someone willing to see beyond what everyone else expected. A dentist looked at an unfamiliar automobile and imagined a different future for transportation. A song created an image of California that people wanted to experience for themselves. Alice Mary Robertson showed that leadership wasn't limited by tradition. Natalie Wood built a career that kept evolving long after many expected it to fade. History rarely changes all at once. More often, it begins when someone quietly expands what's possible, and everyone else slowly begins to see it too. Anyway, after today's research, I found myself wondering how many ordinary moments are happening around us right now that future history books will recognize as the beginning of something much bigger. And that brings us to today's final thought, brought to us by Walt Disney himself. All our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them. If you'd like to hear more of my work or explore the various projects I continue accidentally collecting, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns. Thanks for spending part of your day here. I'll see you tomorrow.